Hey, what's up, guys? What is this? Beute Panzers, right, of World War II, right? Booty, right? Captured tanks and armored fighting vehicles in German service. Very interesting because you see vehicles that you normally associate with, the French or the Soviets with of course, the Balkan Cross, the awesome Balkan Cross on them. Uh, for some reason, there's a lot of this stuff, and what's interesting about it is that more of this stuff was done, but never. There's no evidence, there's no photographic evidence of it. The Germans used a lot of whatever they could all the time. Of course, you see it in the Eastern Front. You always see German soldiers and others with the PPHS, the Russian, the submachine gun with the drum clip. Uh, Very reliable, very effective weapon. So they grab those whenever they could, amongst other things. But what does this tell you in the end, right? Okay, I keep mentioning, right, always the war, right? The whole narrative, the whole Lord of the Rings mythology, Star Wars mythology that we live with today in the Western world, the Anglosphere, and the occupied areas of continental Europe. We live in this idea that there was this evil regime, this uniquely evil people, a uniquely evil leader who wanted to take over the world. Um, Materially, basically this landlocked country was taking on the three empires of the world, well, who controlled literally like more than half the planet logistically, with subjects from one end to the other. It seems very unlikely that this place was going to try to take over the world. Not to mention that they had to supplement their military with the captured, even less than ideal weapons of whatever they could get their hands on. It sort of shows you really what's going on, what really the situation was. But anyway, let's get into it. Of course, they go by the different, of course, the Polish tanks, the Dutch and the Belgians, right? In order of who they fought, the French, right? The British, the Soviets, the Italians, and the Americans. And of course, it's interesting is that the bulk of the German Beute Panzers, right, the Booty Panzers. Of course, in the First War, 2/3 of the what tank force they had were those British tanks they had captured. You see, mostly the French and the Italian armored vehicles are what make up the bulk of their things. It makes sense. They would have places they occupied or were allied with, or both. You had places that could produce these things continuously in a factory. You also had like the Czechoslovakia per se. Well, they don't count this in here because that was before the war, right? The whole idea was you needed spare parts, particularly you needed places that could maintain these tanks, very high maintenance things. There's a reason why everyone says, well, why did they all these Soviet tanks they captured and destroyed? Why didn't they make use of those more than they did? Okay, and you're gonna find out why here. So anyway. And you see immediately that what's also cool is how a lot of the turrets of the tanks that they had captured or were producing uh, ended up as like the Gustav line, all these lines here, these kind of like little pill boxes for fortifications. It's really bizarre to see that. It's almost like surreal to see how many of these things. Anyway, going through here, obviously, the German these tanks that they had captured and were able to use. They say were never more than about 20% of the armored force. I would argue that there were probably more. Even the Germans, notorious for their bookkeeping and writing everything down. There's just too many instances, and you mentioned that here of even the infantry using a captured enemy tank. Like, for example, they don't mention it here in this book, in Monte Cassino, the M4s they had captured from the British, being used by the Germans to supplement their groups here. So, obviously, in this fight, immediately you put someone did graffiti on these tanks. So you'll be surprised who did the graffiti. It wasn't these guys. Anyway, these guys did. These guys actually did these. Obviously, this is to show, and this is also funny too. If you're German, if you're sneaky, why wouldn't you try to hide at these tanks? So obviously you don't want friendly fire, but they're very clear on saying, okay, this tank is our tank, and then of course these are the 7 TPs. These actually caused some trouble for the Germans, right? Of course, you get the tankette, right? The famous economical tankets of the 30s. Of course, this is in Alsace, the French German part here. Camp de Bitch. The tank was used by police and security units. Look at the guy looking at this little thing. What the hell is this? It's amazing these things were still running from so early on in the war. You get more of the fortifications. What is this? Is this the Atlantic Wall? The Belgian tanks. Turret, which is the same, pretty much the same as the French. And what's always cool is these things, right? The Renaults, right? The Renaults was widely used by the Luftwaffe. So you had, when France was taken, you still had a lot of these Renault tanks that were in working order. So essentially, the Germans used these things, obviously for not for intense combat, for security. But it's interesting that they were like, yes, we will use these World War I tanks. Anyway, so now, of course, one of the famous thing here is when they start to convert the idea of, they were doing it with their own tanks, with the Czech tanks and the Panzers too, using these chassis to carry guns. Okay, more on this later. The Becker conversions. Who's Becker? More on that later. And this is a captured British light tank. They had all these tanks in France when the British ran for their lives. Like more tank turrets used, right? These are used as used as fortifications on walls. Of course, more of the French tanks, right? There's the Hotchkiss. Yeah, I always like these tanks. These tanks, the Germans made the best out of them that you could. So anyway, we'll go here now. Of course, the Char B1s. Now these things were they look like something out of Warhammer, right? Really cool. So, and the Germans actually experimented putting the howitzers on them. Of course, the French tanks, the top was not open. The opening was in the back. The Germans were like, "Nein, we shall make this better." They split the tops and had hatches. So, right, the better situational awareness. Of course, and these ones, the Sommers, these were probably the most used French tanks. There was a whole division made up of these Panzer divisions when Normandy happened. So here's one here, right here in Normandy, in the Atlantic Wall, near Dieppe. Right. So anyway, going through here, more Becker conversions. The idea that you had all these French chassis, you had the parts, you had the places that built them because you were in control of France. So you could take these things and maybe put heavier guns on them. You had the French, everyone forgets the French also had half tracks, not just the Americans and the Germans. The French had a half track. Like I said, at the point in the war, the Germans were putting the 75mm Pak 40 on anything that moved. They would have put the damn thing on bicycles if they could. Because when you had this thing, you could knock out any tank that you came across. And of course, it's always sad. Normandy is always, well, I'll get into that later, but Normandy is always sad because most of the footage is just destroyed German tanks. Okay, Normandy's right. The West, their front is always seen as a sideshow compared to the Eastern Front in terms of the numbers. But those 3 or 4 months of fighting from June on into September, those were some real intense, brutal fights. Okay? But the overwhelming material numbers of the Allies and the air power made a big difference. But they paid for it. The Germans made them pay for it. So Of course, I think this is I don't know if this is CGI, computer thing, but these are obviously converted Hotchkisses. Anyway, so you see all the Beute Panzers. Now we're getting to like the British. Now, of course, the Germans didn't really make a lot of use of the British armored vehicles because, I mean, I guess it says something. Okay, the problem also though, the big problem was the same thing with the Soviet, right? They didn't have the spare parts available. They didn't control the factories in Britain where these things were built. They controlled France. They controlled Italy for the most part. So this was the main thing. Of course, you had the famous A-13 cruiser tanks. They had a bunch of these they captured that were sent to Operation Barbarossa. Within 3 weeks, they had all broken down, and there was no spare parts for them. So they sort of didn't last too long. Of course, in North Africa, you had the expedient captures, many times done by the infantry as much as the Panzers, right? It's a Matilda. Right, now the whole thing with the Soviets, now there's always the thing, captured Soviet tanks, okay? Most of them were used for scrap, even the great T-34, okay? But why was it great? Well, the big reason why they didn't use a lot of these Soviet tanks was, once again, the vaunted T-34, and I'm not going to, it had great armor for what it had. The gun was powerful. It was a fast tank. They were not super durable. 200 miles, you had to change a lot of things in them. You had the maintenance you had to do. Many didn't last long. Many were destroyed in combat. Quantity over quality in terms of fighting training. Okay? The Germans would use them, and they wouldn't last too long. Okay? And so you couldn't really use them. So even in Leningrad, they were using like T-30s, and they even had some of these, but they never really, I mean, they were crude tanks. Of course, the armor and the speed and everything was a big deal. But never ever forget, and I'm not trying to undermine the T-34. I think it's a cool tank. Never forget that, as cool as these tanks were, if you didn't have an overwhelming number of them, you wouldn't have had the effect that you did. Let's be honest. You never see more knocked out tanks than these things. And obviously, even like both the Wehrmacht and the SS were trying to use these when they could. Of course, they did the same thing, right? They would make the hatches better. They would put skirts on the side. And in Kursk, the Das Reich had a whole unit of this. One of the guys was he took out a bunch of Soviet tanks with this. So, like I said, the T-34 was a good tank, but the main problem, as they said, was the replacement parts. Of course, near the end, the Italians, they had a lot of the Italian armored vehicles being used. Now, most were used for the partisan warfare, both in northern Italy and in Yugoslavia, but some of the ones, like the Semoventi, like the self-propelled guns, were actually pretty decent weapons. Like this one, even the bigger guns coming out, or like the P-40, which was like they're going to be their... This tank actually probably would have done really well, but it was too little, too late. Most of these were, used by Germans and by the loyal Italians. Okay, remember the AB 4120, right? They're great, very underrated armored car. Anyway, now the American tanks. Now of course they use some of these, right? The M3 light tanks. You have them in all throughout using M4s. The Germans particularly like to use them as ammo carriers, but in Monte Cassino, in the Ardennes, and the Fallschirmjägers use these. These are not Panzer guys. Now, this is the old thing. Usually the Panzer units wouldn't use too many of these, but a lot of the infantries would use them. It's interesting. You wonder how they would figure out how to use them, but you got to figure the manuals were all in there. So, and the Germans were probably pretty good at reading them, right? So... And this is a higher end M4, right? In early April 45. It's almost all over. They actually wrote booty pans on here to prevent the German troops from knocking it out. But obviously, very interesting. Cool. It shows you that the Germans had no chance when they were trying to use, whatever they could. Now, I'm going to cover this just briefly. There's no reason to. Of course, the German tanks in Normandy. I said Normandy was pretty savage fighting for what it was. Okay, in terms of numbers, it didn't compare to the Eastern Front, but I mean, you have naval artillery, you have air power, smashing the Germans. You have the majority of the Germans unable to even go out in the day. You have no resupply. You have guys with no food and hardly any ammo fighting on. Okay, frontal attacks were very risky in the day and decimated by air power. But the Anglo-Americans never, if they didn't have the overwhelming numbers, they never would. They would have had a real problem with these guys. But not just that. There was some. They did some. The Germans made some mistakes as well. So anyway, I'm only bringing this up. It's depressing to always see the Normandy stuff because you always see all these knocked out German tanks anywhere. Although a third of them are abandoned because it just didn't work anymore. So, but I want to focus briefly on the the Panzer II, the heavily armored one they had at the end. Remember the Panzer II, right? The chassis was used for a lot of conversions. But I want to bring up, and also the awesome, very futuristic Koenigs Tiger with the Porsche turret. But I want to bring up, as I end this video, the underrated and just the focus now. I mentioned Becker, right? The Becker conversions right here, particularly on the Hotchkiss. They call it the Geschutzwagen. You had the 75 Quack and the 105 millimeter howitzer versions of these things. He made a bunch of these conversions. Well, these things punched way above their weight in actual combat. And I'll show you here real quick as I look at all these depressing videos of knocked out German tanks. Right here. These things, both in Operation Goodwood, Operation Totalize, particularly Goodwood, when a whole regiment of these was knocked out by aerial bombardment, but the other 4 regiments survived. These things literally stopped the British armored attack in its tracks. These things, these Frankenstein, you would say ugly looking, almost like rhinoceros looking sort of bootleg Beute Panzers, right? Made just to carry guns on pretty crappy tanks, to be frank, originally. Well, these things really punched above their weight. Goodwood, they probably destroyed 300 plus British tanks. Totalized, they totally stopped as well. And there was never more than like 40 of each kind of these things. So they tried to make the best that they could. Of course, you got the awesome Jag Panther, okay? But what do you see here? Most of these stopped working. Most of these were not knocked out. They just were abandoned. So you have one towing another one. So it's always very frustrating. And never forget, with all the super tanks, the majority of your German tanks in Normandy or on the Eastern Front were the Panzer Mark IVs. Right? So, but just like I said, I wanted to give some attention to these awesome Becker conversions. Using what you had and making the best of it, and even though you lost, heroically showing what could be done with a good crew and a good fucking gun. Yes, right. Like I said, if they could have put them on fucking bicycles, they would have been knocking out tanks. You will not be forgotten, at least not by me, because of the blood. They're my blood. Anyone watching this video randomly going, ooh, you come up with things, that's fine. You probably, I don't have a problem with it. You don't have German blood from these people directly like I do. So I'm for them, right? And that's all. That's all I need.